They say the first cities of the Americas were not built of stone or wood, but of shells. Imagine a gleaming white settlement under the midday sun, the walls sparkling like they were dusted with crushed pearl, the ground crumbling softly underfoot with the remains of millions of oysters, clams, and conch. The people here are masters of the tide. They build their homes on mounds of shell so high that storms cannot touch them. They cast nets woven from palm fiber, their canoes gliding silently between the mangrove roots. And when they return, their catch is carried not only for food, but for ritual. For them, the sea is not just a place of work. It is a temple, a market, and a road to the rest of the world. And yet, these people have no name in our modern history books. Archaeologists call them shell mound builders or coastal foragers, but these words are hollow compared to the complexity of what they built. From Florida to California, from the shores of Peru to the islands of the Pacific Northwest, there were once entire civilizations whose wealth and identity came from the ocean, and whose cities have since been swallowed by it. Their legacy lies scattered in rings and ridges of shell, half buried beneath sand, hidden under shallow waves, and in the stories whispered by the descendants of those who once lived where the tide now rules. In the American Southeast, shell architecture reached monumental proportions. Archaeologists have uncovered vast shell rings, some nearly 300 feet across, dating back 4,000 years or more. These rings were not just garbage piles, they were carefully shaped ceremonial spaces, encircling plazas where feasts, dances, and rituals played out under the moonlight. In some places, like Sapelo Island in Georgia or Hawes Island in Florida, entire villages were arranged on elevated platforms of shell. These platforms lifted homes and temples above the reach of floods, turning the settlement into an island fortress surrounded by salt marsh and sea. The people here traded shell for stone, copper, and exotic goods from deep inland. Shell beads, drilled with astonishing precision, became currency. Some were buried with the dead, others sewn into garments, and some strung into sacred belts that told the stories of treaties and ancestry. And then came the water's slow revenge. Over centuries, rising seas and shifting shorelines erased many of these sites. Whole mounds slipped into the ocean. Others were battered apart by hurricanes. Today, fishermen in the Gulf still pull up pottery shards and carved bone from nets set in water. But this was not a phenomenon of the Southeast alone. Along the Pacific coast, from California to British Columbia, there were also shell people, maritime cultures who hunted sea lions, fished salmon runs, and dove for abalone. Their villages clung to rocky headlands, often fortified with shell embankments. In the Channel Islands, archaeologists have found evidence of early seafaring technology, plank canoes capable of open-water voyages, and toolkits for working shell into fishhooks, ornaments, and even musical instruments. Farther north, the coastal Salish peoples wove shell symbolism into their mythic traditions, the spiral of a snail's shell representing cycles of life and return. Many of these Pacific shell villages vanished in sudden moments. Tsunamis triggered by offshore earthquakes, landslides that sent whole stretches of coastline tumbling into the sea. Oral traditions speak of the night the tide did not stop, when waves climbed higher than the tallest trees and entire towns were erased in a single night. Divers today explore submerged ledges off the coasts of Oregon and Washington, where ancient fish traps still lie, stone channels designed to funnel salmon into nets. These are the fingerprints of the shell people, frozen in place beneath the water, untouched for centuries. To the south, in the lands of modern Peru and Ecuador, the Shell people were tied to one of the most mysterious luxury goods of the ancient Americas, the spondylus shell. This deep-water mollusk, with its bright red and purple interior, was considered a gift of the sea gods. Diving for spondylus was dangerous work, done without modern equipment, in cold, shark-filled waters. Those who succeeded were celebrated, and their cargo was carried far inland along trade routes that stretched across mountains and deserts. In Andean temples, spondylus shells were buried with the dead or ground into powder for offerings. They symbolized fertility, rain, and the blessing of the sea. But here, too, the ocean claimed its own. Coastal cities, some already ancient when the Inca rose to power, were destroyed by El Niño floods, or swallowed by sand when the shoreline shifted. Oral histories speak of cities whose streets were paved with shell, where the air rang with conch trumpets, and where the markets sold fish, fresh from the net, alongside goods brought from lands hundreds of miles away. The shells remain, but the cities are gone, their names lost to the tide. Even inland peoples were drawn into the shell economy. In the Mississippi Valley, shell beads traveled alongside copper from the Great Lakes and obsidian from the Rockies. In the deserts of the Southwest, Hohokam artisans carved shell from the Gulf of California into intricate bracelets and inlaid mosaics. These inland artifacts speak to the power of shell as both a material and a symbol, a connection to the distant sea and the wealth of those who could command such trade. In some places, entire political alliances were sealed with the exchange of shell, as if it were more than mere ornament, but a token of cosmic favor. Yet as the centuries passed, storms, erosion, and the slow march of the ocean erased much of the original coastal infrastructure that made this trade possible. Villages disappeared, harbors silted over, shell embankments dissolved back into the sand. All that remains are the scattered clues: a shell pendant in a desert grave, a ring of oyster shells in a marsh, a story told by an elder about a city that now lies under the waves. The Shell people are a reminder that history is not only written in stone, it is written in fragile things, in the glitter of a seashell, in the salt-stiff fibers of a fishing net, in the hollow note of a conch horn carried across water. They were masters of the tide, builders of cities that breathed with the ocean, traders who connected distant worlds, and yet, the ocean they revered has taken most of their story. In the end, the sea keeps its own secrets. We find their middens and call them trash heaps, but to those who built them, they were walls, plazas, temples, and records of abundance. We see their submerged fish traps and call them curiosities, but they were once engines of survival and wealth. Perhaps the Shell people are not truly gone. Perhaps they live on in the coastal nations who still harvest shellfish in the old ways, who still decorate with the spiral and the scallop, who still tell the stories of drowned cities. The tide may rise, the shore may change, but the ocean remembers. And if we listen closely, in the hiss of the waves and the whisper of a shell held to the ear, we may still hear their voices. But the story of the Shell people is not only about what has been lost, it is also about what may still be hidden. Across the world, new technologies like LiDAR mapping and sub-bottom sonar are revealing ancient landscapes beneath shallow seas. Along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, researchers have detected strange, ring-shaped anomalies under a few feet of water, shapes eerily similar to the great shell rings found on land. Off the coast of California, Divers have documented underwater terraces littered with shell debris, suggesting that entire fishing villages now rest in places reachable only with scuba gear. In Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, scientists have traced submerged riverbeds that once ran through fertile coastal plains, home to settlements now 200 feet below the surface. And yet for every site confirmed, dozens more are hinted at only by legend. The Gullah people of the Carolina coast speak of an island that would rise from the sea at low tide, revealing stone walls and shell streets before sinking again. Fishermen in the Gulf tell of snagging their nets on ghost docks far from shore. And in the far reaches of the Pacific, indigenous navigators recall wayfinding by islands that no longer exist. If these stories hold truth, and history suggests they often do, then the map of the Americas as we know it is incomplete. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the tide's daily rhythm, there may still lie untouched shell cities, their plazas intact, their artifacts waiting, their stories sealed away in salt and silence. Perhaps one day, the tide will give them back.